I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs, and I am pleased to introduce you to tonight's Hammer Forum on tackling climate change nationally and globally with Brenda Ekwurzel and Michael Mann, and moderated by Ian Masters. Before we get started, I want to remind you to please silence your cell phones, and please note that taking photographs and video and audio recording are not permitted in the theater. I also want to quickly mention some Hammer upcoming programs you might be interested in. In the next Hammer Forum on November 19th, we have 3 scholars from the 21st Century China program at UC San Diego joining us to examine China's domestic challenges. In December, the forum will look at the current political climate in Venezuela, and in January, we'll examine internet privacy. Also, on November 6th, the Hammer Museum will celebrate Joni Mitchell's birthday with Joni herself here in person. So there's never been a better time to be a Hammer member. If you'd like to receive reminder emails about upcoming events, please sign up for our email list in our lobby. You can also always find out more on our website. And the last 3 Hammer forums were just uploaded as video podcasts and are available on the Hammer's website as well as on Vimeo and YouTube. So on to tonight's program. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with the generous support of Andy and Brenda Galef. In tonight's forum, we'll discuss international efforts to reduce CO2 emissions using new and old technologies in an effort to turn back the clock on climate change. When we get to the Q&A portion of the evening, please respect our house rules, including keeping your questions to the topic at hand, and please keep your questions brief and straightforward and directed towards our guest speakers. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ian Masters, who will introduce the panelists. Ian is a BBC-trained broadcast journalist who's covered national security affairs for over 25 years on public radio. He's the host of the Daily Briefing every Monday through Thursday at 5 p.m., as well as Background Briefing on Sundays at 11 a.m., all on KPFK 90.7 FM. Ian has been a senior fellow at UCLA's Center for Strategic and International Affairs and the UCLA Center for International Relations, and was a consultant to the Center for National Security Studies at Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Ian Masters.
Thank you, Claudia, and all of you for coming tonight to engage in a discussion about what can be done, what should be done, and what is being done to reverse the increase of CO2 emissions in the atmosphere that contribute to global warming. The overwhelming scientific consensus is that the planet has already reached dangerous levels of CO2 in the atmosphere and is heading towards an irreversible concentration of greenhouse gases that will trigger a feedback loop of self-reinforcing and exponential release of more greenhouse gases as the Arctic tundra melts and releases more and more of the most virulent of greenhouse gases, methane. Clearly, we have a disconnect between scientific realities and political possibilities, and between national approaches to solving the problem and global efforts to deal with it collectively. Indeed, this has led to a chicken and egg dynamic that has reinforced paralysis, with developing nations demanding that developed nations who are responsible for the current atmospheric pollution act first, while the less developed are free to contribute to more greenhouse gases in the future as they attempt to enjoy the fruits of a higher standard of living that the industrialized nations already have. The world's biggest polluter, China, makes that argument, as does the world's 3rd biggest polluter, India, while the world's 2nd biggest polluter, the United States, whose rate of emissions was going down until last year when it spiked back up, has become the global poster boy for political gridlock, with obstruction and ideological warfare in Washington at an embarrassing level of dysfunction. Meanwhile, the world's worst polluter in terms of emissions on a per capita basis, Australia, has reversed course after being the first nation to introduce a carbon tax, electing a thuggish reactionary Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, a global warming denier who is determined to turn Australia into China's quarry while praising clean coal as being great for humanity. And ironically, this is happening when the recent report on global warming from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, singles out Australia as the country most affected by climate change that will lead to even greater destructions to Australian property and wildlife from bushfires, devastation to the agricultural sector, and crippling droughts in the future. There is, however, in this otherwise bleak landscape of global buck passing, the example of Germany, the world's most successful export economy, who are not only abiding by the moribund Kyoto protocols, but are exceeding its targets as they phase out coal for wind and solar. This in a country that is not blessed with the endless sun like California, where the lights in this auditorium are kept on largely by burning coal. But nevertheless, non-polluting sustainable energy has reached the point in Germany where recently the country celebrated a day when alternative energy supplied more than 50% of the grid. And as a footnote, Germany is phasing out nuclear power that some environmentalists and many others see as the green alternative to coal. The other piece of good news, if we are to believe the clean energy TV commercials, is that the fracking boom is bringing on so much natural gas that the US has surpassed Russia as the world's biggest supplier as we start to free ourselves from our long dependence on foreign oil. This has certainly made coal less attractive and competitive, but the jury is still out on the net gain of burning the less polluting natural gas if it is offset by the leakage of methane from fracking and the leakage throughout the grid from the fields of Montana up to the gas range in the home. Having talked to many experts in the field, I am told there is still no reliable accounting of how much methane leaks. And since methane is so much worse in terms of global warming than CO2, we don't really know what the actual benefits are from switching to natural gas as an interim step. And finally, when we say interim step, you have to ask, where is the evidence of the new post-carbon world that we hope to step into after we stop burning coal, oil, and natural gas? When will we see this halcyon green new world of alternative energy? We are told it is the energy of the future, but will it always be that? The energy of the future, always beckoning on a distant horizon until there is no future. Can solar and wind bridge the gap as we wean ourselves from polluting energy and reduce our carbon footprint? And why isn't this proven technology being scaled up as it is in Germany? And where, apart from Elon Musk of Tesla Motors, are the green entrepreneurs who will save us? With gas prices now going down and dropping to below $3 a gallon in some parts of America, there has been a sudden drop in the sale of hybrid and electric cars, with a commensurate spike upwards in the sales of gas-guzzling SUVs and pickup trucks. So surely Elon Musk alone cannot save us. Some questions for tonight's guests. And we will begin with Michael Mann, who was part of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He will speak for 10 to 15 minutes and will lay out the scientific evidence, the likely impacts, and the political factors that have thus far stymied progress in dealing with climate change. And then we will hear from Brenda Ekwurzel, a climatologist with the Union of Concerned Scientists, she'll be talking about what is being done to tackle global warming on a national level. So let me begin with Michael Mann. He is the director of the Earth Systems Science Center at Penn State University. He is a co-founder and contributor to the award-winning science website realclimate.org, and he contributed with others to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. His books include Dire Predictions, Understanding Global Warming, and The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, Dispatches from the Front Lines. He will speak first, followed by Brenda. We'll have a discussion, and then we'll have extensive Q&A with you, our audience. Michael Mann.
Well, thanks very much, Ian, and thanks to all of you for coming out this evening. I'm going to start out talking about the basic scientific evidence for human-caused climate change. It happens that the evidence is actually fairly straightforward, despite the fact that this is often presented in our media coverage, in our public discourse, often presented as something that's controversial. In fact, the science isn't controversial. The fact that certain gases in our atmosphere, like carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases, warm the atmosphere, it's been known for nearly 2 centuries. Scientists like Joseph Fourier, who discovered the law of heat conduction in the early 1800s, understood that these gases have a warming influence on our planet. And the fact that we are increasing the concentrations of these gases in an unprecedented way, again, that is not contested. This shows the CO2 increases over the past half century or so. It's a plot that I put together a couple years ago, and it's already out of date. In fact, you have to add another vertical tick mark to the scale, because last year, for the first time in probably several million years, we passed the 400 parts per million CO2 level in the atmosphere. So that's really all you have to know. Greenhouse gases warm the atmosphere. We are increasing them in an unprecedented way from fossil fuel burning and other human activities. What I wouldn't be able to explain to you as a scientist would be if the Earth were not warming up as a result of that. But of course, the Earth is warming up. It's warmed up a little less than a degree Celsius over the past century. And if you're a critic, and there are critics when it comes to the science of climate change, and you don't accept thermometer measurements, I could show you dozens of independent lines of evidence that tell an internally consistent story of a planet that's warming up and a climate that is changing much as we expect it to, as we continue to increase the concentrations of these gases. And so that's the sort of evidence that has led this very staid organization, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to conclude that the warming of the climate system is unequivocal in its most recent report published over the last year. This is a report put out every 5 or 6 years by thousands of scientists around the world studying the science of climate change. It is by construction a conservative report because it reflects those conclusions that all of these scientists can come into agreement on. And so it's really pretty remarkable for them to state something in as strong terms as this statement here. And in fact, not only that the warming is unequivocal, but the IPCC has very clearly concluded that we can only explain that warming from human factors. Natural factors cannot explain the warming that we've seen over the past century. This is from an article I published earlier this year in Scientific American, and what it's showing you is that we could still avoid passing the 2 degrees Celsius warming level relative to pre-industrial time, 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the amount of warming that scientists who study the impacts of climate change will tell you is where we start to get into what can reasonably be defined as dangerous and potentially irreversible changes in our climate. But if we continue with business as usual, we're well on our way to 4 to 5 degrees Celsius warming, 7 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit warming of the planet by the end of the century, twice that much in the Arctic because of the amplifying effect of melting ice. A planet that, in the words of James Hansen, the former director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, is a different planet. We're talking about a different planet, not the planet that we grew up on. Now, I used to stop here with the polar bear, because it's actually the law. You have to show a polar bear in any public lecture about climate change. But I realized that in sort of making the polar bear the poster child of global warming and climate change, we were wrongly conveying the notion that this is some distant, far-off, exotic threat. And it isn't. It is something that is influencing us now. I don't really have to try to convince folks in Southern California that we are seeing the negative impacts of climate change. Everywhere I go now, whether it's Central Texas, whether it's Maine, whether it's Northwest Missouri, or Florida, which just experienced this phenomenon a couple weeks ago, the king tide, something that happens every year, a seasonal high tide. But you know what didn't used to happen every year? That the streets of Miami would be flooded by that tide. And what we're seeing now is the encroaching of global sea level rise and the fact that, yes, it takes a seasonal high tide to flood the streets of Miami now. A few decades from now, it'll just take a monthly high tide. And pretty soon, the average tide. I gave a talk in Queens about a month ago, which saw the devastation caused by Hurricane Sandy, which wasn't caused by climate change, but I could describe to you in detail how it was made worse by climate change. If nothing else, 1 foot of global sea level rise made what would have been a 12-foot coastal surge in Battery Park, New York, a 13-foot coastal surge. 25 square miles of additional flooding because of that 1 foot. And that is the veritable tip of the iceberg. We project we could see anywhere from 3 to 6 feet by the end of this century if we continue with business as usual. And again, in California, I think you are seeing right now the impacts of climate change. No, it didn't cause this drought, but it certainly exacerbated this drought. There's a reason that this is the worst drought that California has ever seen, not just an average drought, but a devastating drought. And it's a sign of things to come if we continue on this course that we're on. So at this point, you might well ask, if the scientific evidence is this clear, if the threat is this obvious, why no action? And that leads to the other part of the talk, where we're no longer in the realm of science. We're leaving the realm of science and venturing into the realm of politics. After all, we have a very powerful industry, the fossil fuel industry, that profits greatly from our current, what former President George W. Bush referred to as our addiction to fossil fuels. And they have spent hundreds of millions of dollars in funding a campaign to discredit the science of climate change, to downplay the threats of climate change. And so it isn't a coincidence that we have senators like James Inhofe, who could become the chair of the House Environment and Public Works Committee if the Republicans regain control of the Senate in this next election. James Inhofe has pronounced climate change the single greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. In fact, I have to tell a short story. He had been invited to give the keynote lecture at the annual meeting of the Heartland Institute, which is an industry-funded think tank that worked for the tobacco industry decades ago to discredit the linkage between their product and lung cancer and other human health ailments, and today are working to discredit the science of climate change, funded by fossil fuel interests, folks like the Koch brothers. He had been invited to give their keynote address at their annual climate change denial conference in Washington, D.C. Back in the summer of 2011, he had to cancel out at the last minute, unfortunately. He had gotten ill swimming in a lake back in his home state of Oklahoma that was suffering from an algal bloom as a result of the unprecedented heat and drought that Oklahoma was experiencing at the time. So it didn't happen. Okay, so we've seen how politics has infected the public discourse on climate change. How did I find myself at the center of this raging debate? A double major, UC Berkeley, applied math and physics, went off to graduate school in physics, then wandered into an area called climate science because it sounded interesting to me. Ended up eventually publishing this graph. It came to be known as the hockey stick, which demonstrated the unprecedented nature of the warming we've seen over the past century. And I found myself at the center of this contentious debate over human-caused climate change when this graph became an icon in the climate change debate. It was featured prominently in the summary for policymakers of the third assessment report of the IPCC in 2001, and it was attacked vehemently by those looking, again, to discredit the case for concern over human-caused climate change. It doesn't matter that there's now a veritable hockey league, dozens of these sorts of reconstructions, and they don't all agree on all the details. But every study of this sort that's been published in the peer-reviewed literature has come to the conclusion that the recent warming really is unprecedented as far back as we can go. And yeah, it probably has something to do with what human beings are doing. But you don't need the hockey stick or the hockey league. You could throw out all this information. We would still know that climate change is real, that it's caused by us, and it's a problem. I laid out the evidence for that in the first half of this talk, and it didn't involve the hockey stick or the hockey league. It involved basic physics and chemistry we've known for nearly 2 centuries, irrefutable measurements of how we are changing the composition of the atmosphere and how it's warming in response, and how that pattern of warming is consistent with what models predict when we increase the concentrations of these gases, and is inconsistent with what any natural factors could be doing. But it doesn't matter, even though it's hardly the pillar of evidence for climate change, and there are literally dozens of similar studies now coming to the same conclusion anyways. The fact is that the hockey stick remains this iconic image in the climate change debate, and so I continue to have to fend off attacks by folks like James Inhofe or his counterpart in the U.S. House of Representatives, Joe Barton of Texas, who was the chair of the House Energy and Environment Committee, and subpoenaed all of my emails from my entire career because he read a criticism of my work on the editorial pages of that leading journal, the Wall Street Journal. Fortunately, there are also Republicans like Sherwood Boehlert, who was the chair of the House Science Committee at the same time, and called out his fellow Republican, Joe Barton, in some of the harshest terms of anybody, even harsher terms than used by Henry Waxman, a representative from Southern California, who helped bring the tobacco industry to justice for hiding the impacts of their product and has fought to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable. It was actually Sherwood Boehlert who had the toughest words for Joe Barton when he went after me and my colleagues. And the fact is that there are still conservatives who don't want to think of themselves as the party of anti-science, who have warned their party that if they go down this road of politicizing science and attacking scientists, they risk forever making the party that people like Sherwood Boehlert still love, the Republican Party, the party of anti-science. And so I think we're at a critical juncture now where there are conservatives who are willing to talk about the solutions to this problem, who are willing to recognize that, the science is in. This is a problem. We need to deal with it. It's already taking a tremendous toll. And we can make sure that discussions of solutions are informed by our ideological principles. Let's have that worthy debate about how to solve this problem. And conservatives and progressives, everybody should be at that table in discussing how we deal with this problem. But let's not continue to pretend that the problem doesn't exist. Finally, I'd like to, and of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger is a Republican who has fought for an informed discussion of the solutions to this problem. Let me finally leave this on a personal note, because climate change too often is framed entirely as a problem of science, or a problem of politics or economics, cost-benefit analysis. To me, more than anything else, it's a problem of ethics, intergenerational ethics in particular. This is my daughter, and that is a polar bear, and I promise we are not torturing her here. This is at the Pittsburgh Zoo. You can walk through a plexiglass tunnel that goes underneath the polar bear feeding pool. And if you happen to be involved in an NSF-funded project to develop climate change outreach materials for zoos and aquaria, and you know the manager of the zoo, you might be able to convince him to throw the fish in the pool when your daughter's walking underneath, which is what's happening here. But on a serious note, I'd hate to think that decades from now my daughter would return to this zoo and point to these, with her children or her grandchildren, and point to these magnificent creatures and talk about how they used to exist in the wild, but we literally melted their home. And of course, that's just symbolic of a much broader array of very damaging impacts that climate change is going to have on health, on water, on food, on national security, on our economy, across the board, if we don't do something about it. The good news is that there is still time to turn this ship around. There is still time to do something about this problem. So I think I'll leave it there, and we'll have time for discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mann. Dr. Brenda Ekwurzel is a climate scientist from the Union of Concerned Scientists. She is leading the Union of Concerned Scientists' climate science education work aimed at strengthening support for strong federal climate legislation and sound U.S. climate policies. Her specialty is isotope geochemistry, a tool she has used to study climate variability in places as disparate as the Arctic Ocean and the desert Southwest. Dr. Ekwurzel completed her doctorate work at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory of Columbia University and her postdoctoral research at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Brenda Ekwurzel.
Thank you so much, and I really appreciate everyone showing up today to talk about this important topic. And most of all, I also really want to thank you, Ian, for inviting me to the Hammer Forum, and to Darren Klein and Claudia Bastor for making all the steps leading up to this moment quite a smooth one, as well as Mike for sharing the stage tonight. Thanks so much. So I wanted to pivot to the topic where we're talking about tackling climate change. And what I'm going to talk about is the national portion of this massive, massive challenge that we're facing. And what I'm first going to do is talk about why will the U.S. Have some of those impacts. You're going to see some of the science that you've seen before, but I wanted to first give you a personal note of where I first encountered climate change. And really it was inspired by the Hammer Forum poster, because this is where I was collecting samples off of this Swedish icebreaker. I was collecting water samples in the Arctic Ocean that held clues within it that could tell me the history of Arctic sea ice melt. And during this research expedition, it was usually whiteout conditions. We couldn't see much beyond the ship, and we could hear the crunching of the ice. And this was a very rare day. It was suddenly, there was no whiteout conditions, and I got to go up in a helicopter and see this massive area of open water. Now, when you have in the Arctic open water exposed, it's a 24-hour sunlight situation in the summer. That sunlight hitting snow normally gets reflected back into space. As soon as you uncover and have massive areas of open water, now that sunlight hitting there is absorbed by that water. And this is one of the reasons why you'll hear Mike and others say that the Arctic is warming faster than many other places on the planet. It's because of this Arctic amplification, and that has consequences for the United States and other places around the world. Now, I was shocked. The very next morning, we reached the North Pole, and it was an easy sail. And I thought, is this a fluke? Were the winds blowing the ice around and created this open water? I did not expect to see vast areas of open water. And I realized what I was studying was small compared to climate change. This is that moment on the graph of shrinking Arctic sea ice volume. As you can tell, there is some variability, but the long trend is a downward shrinking of Arctic sea ice. And we could repeat this for ice sheets and land glaciers, but this was a very serious trend, and it's having consequences. And of course, the reason is because we have unprecedented levels of heat trapping carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, levels that at least are unprecedented since at least the last 800,000 years. So shifting to the continental United States, you see a lot of what makes the news or extreme events. So I thought I'd share with you some of the scientific evidence to date about where the strongest links are. The bigger the circle, the stronger the evidence. And so heat waves, coastal flooding with sea level rise, extreme precipitation events, and in some places, severe droughts. So the coastal flooding, of course, you just heard the story of why that extra boost from sea level rise made Sandy's storm surge so devastating to the New York region. In the recent nuisance flooding, colleagues, we projected the nuisance flooding from NOAA out into the future. And in 15 years, some of these places will have chronic nuisance flooding, tidal flooding. And of course, it's because we're warming the oceans, expanding them, reducing the ice, shrinking the ice, and expanding sea level rise. And many, many people, you'll see in the United States, those states with the boldest color, darkest color of red, they have the most people within 3 feet of sea level rise. And depending on our emissions, that could be something we avoid this century, or it could be a couple decades hence. It's really, really critical, the pace of change, and a lot of the emissions we emit and the choices we make will help determine that sea level rise. So precipitation events, the heaviest events, are getting heavier in the form of rain and snow. And here in Fresno, California, this graph, the nighttime temperatures and the summer heat waves are accelerating in that they are rising much faster. And what we see is that during a heat wave, if you don't have relief at night, the second, third day of that heat wave, severe health effects can start happening. And here's a picture from people who are suffering from the heat wave. And of course, when you're warming up the temperature and you're drying out the soils, you increase your drought risk. And this is a California farmer that lost 20% of his almond crop because he did not have access to water. And of course, you know Lake Mead is a reservoir that is lowering the levels. And unfortunately, the drought monitor, the most recent one, the exceptional drought in California, as I'm sure you all are so aware, is still not any relief yet. But projecting climate change going forward from the National Climate Assessment, what also matters to the Southwest and Southern California is looking forward. Look at those graphs on the lower right for the Colorado River flows. The further we go out this century with a scenario with climate change emissions, that river basin may be much drier than we've experienced in the past. And the Colorado River Compact was signed during a very wet period of that river. And so this region is figuring out ways to how to harness the water resources so that we can live in a sustainable way. And then if you're drying out your soils, of course, your fire risk is something that's going up. And Bandelier National Monument, the Las Conchas fire, trying to protect adobe Puebloan structures that have survived for thousands of years. And we have major costs to fight these fires. So the country's asking, what can we do? And the forests are something also that are changing. There's a lot of factors in this. We see the old growth. We're seeing a higher mortality rate, even in areas that haven't been affected by beetle pests, have not been affected by human activities. We're seeing a higher rate of mortality. And so this graph, my colleagues, we put out this report just 2 months ago showing the Rocky Mountains. And you'll notice, especially for California, the water supply does depend on these forests. It may seem very distant, these beautiful Rocky Mountain forests, but in the future emission scenarios, it's a very different forest. A lot of the pine trees are shrinking their range, and the southern section of the Rocky Mountains are drying out, and they're getting too hot, basically. So this is affecting, the forests are also affecting the water resources and the timing of snowmelt. So let's pivot to what can we do? $1 billion. That's what the president proposed in 2015 for a climate resilience fund. When you compare that to the cost of a lot of the disasters that we're having to react to some of these events that are made worse or more severe because of climate change, that is a very paltry sum. So that's a start, and people are looking at ways to look at climate adaptation. All the purple colors are the states and localities that have completed their climate adaptation plans. And they have a plan in place, but you can see it's spotty. Many parts of the country just have not even dealt with this issue. And I would posit that we can go a long way to coping with climate change. However, I think it speaks for itself. There really are limits to adaptation. I mean, how far can we adapt our way out of this problem? So this is a figure for United States emissions. And this is from a book I was co-author of, where we were looking at, I was focusing on the climate change aspects of that book, but when you look at the US emissions of every person living in the United States, what their activities that related to heat trapping emissions in the atmosphere, you'll see that it starts adding up into bins of heating in the home and the stuff we buy and transportation. And you can look at this book that we wrote and get some practical advice to try to reduce your personal emissions. For example, if you were to upgrade your car and you drove the average amount of typical American average over the life of the car for 15 years, you could skip filling up 4,500 gallons. I know the price of gas, Ian was saying, was going low, but maybe over those next 15 years, it might get back up to $4. So at $4 a gallon, you would save $18,000. So that's a pretty good down payment for a nice car. So basically, it saves you money, but it's much better for the atmosphere. But those personal solutions can only go so far. So California has really led the nation in the first declining cap that was 2 to 3% per year until 2020. The ultimate goal was to reduce emissions down 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. So this is a landmark AB 32 that the voters of California voted to keep in place and on the books. So California is leading the way. At the federal level, we're looking at the successes of California and seeing all the renewable portfolio standards going through California and other parts of the country. And at the federal level, if you look at this graph, this is the first time since 1985 fuel economy standards were recently, in the past couple of years, we've updated them. That was a long gap. So now by 2011, you have to get further down the road on a gallon of fuel. In 2016, there's new standards. By 2025, we're going to have fuel economy standards. You're going over 54 miles down the road on a gallon of fuel. So this is going to take a big chunk out of our transportation sector at the federal level. There's also, in June, just this year, EPA proposed what's called the Clean Power Plant Rule. So that's against existing power plants. And this is the largest source of U.S. emissions. So California showed that it can be done. The economy's still healthy, and we can start reducing emissions. So that emboldened the federal landscape. This is a proposed rule, and the comment period is closing soon. And this is a good news graph. We have decoupled the American economy. We have population growth in green. We have real GDP for the United States, and yet per capita emissions are going down. This is a good news graph. I would say this graph tells us that that's allowing us to hold pretty steady in the recent years. And we've recently, Ian was mentioning that we had a big uptick again in this last year. In this graph, of course, the EPA, this is the most recent data from the EPA report, and it ends in 2012. The ultimate arbiter, of course, is the atmosphere. And we're not the only nation on the planet. And that curve, unfortunately, is still going up. In fact, we had the most massive increase in atmospheric rate of CO2 rise in this last year. So we still have a long way to go. And I really look forward to your suggestions and discussion on where do we go from here. What are your ideas? And we'll discuss potential solutions. Thank you so much.
We'll move them in like this. Thank you, Brenda. So let me start with you, Michael. You talked a lot about how the intersection of science and politics has created a kind of dead end, or at least has stalled the debate. I'm frankly astounded, and I could never understand this. My dealings with scientists have always led me to conclude that they are the most conservative people on the planet. They never get out ahead of their own research. It's hard to get anything definitive out of them. I remember interviewing, I don't know whether you work with Edward Teller, but I knew him pretty well, and I remember talking to him about this so-called discovery up in Utah of nuclear fusion, and he said, I don't have it. Well, the guys that did that were just totally discredited. They're finished, they're toast, because they got out ahead of themselves. So scientists don't make stuff up, do they? They're very conservative.
Yeah, I mean, in the words of Carl Sagan, science has self-correcting machinery. If you're wrong, you will be shown to have been wrong. You will be found out if you fudge your data, if you commit some impropriety, you'll be found out, because that's what's wonderful about science. It has this self-correcting machinery. If you put out an idea and it conflicts with what's known, you're going to attract the attention of other scientists. They're going to want to get to the bottom of it, and they're going to want to try to solve the mystery. And in science, you're rewarded for that. You sometimes hear this claim from the critics that, the climate scientists, they're just all on this government gravy train to prove that climate change is real, because that's what brings in all this grant money. Well, first of all, that grant money doesn't go to your pockets. Our critics would like you to think that we're getting rich off it. It funds our research program. But the fact is that the way you get ahead in science is by proving other people wrong. The way you get an article in Nature or Science is by finding something new, making an innovation. And the idea that you could get thousands of scientists around the world to conspire to create a hoax, in the words of James Inhofe, and somehow get the oceans and the ice sheets to play along with this hoax is really pretty remarkable, because as Brenda and I can tell you, you get three of us in a room, and it's going to be hard to get us to agree on just about anything. We are by our nature sort of a cantankerous lot. Skepticism is a good thing in science. You should be skeptical. That's part of that self-correcting machinery. But indiscriminate denunciations of mainstream science based on the most simplistic and flawed arguments, that's not skepticism. That's contrarianism or denial. And so make no mistake, many of those who would like you to think that they are skeptics are not real skeptics, because all good scientists are skeptics. We hold each other accountable. The more fantastic the claim, the more fantastic the evidence has to be. And again, I'm paraphrasing another Carl Sagan, famous Carl Sagan quote. So, the fact is we are conservative, because if you are, the last thing a scientist wants to do is to get out ahead of what the evidence supports. You will be held accountable. You will be denounced. You will be, shown to have been wrong. And that's the worst thing that can happen to a scientist. So that's why when you read these reports, like the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, when they use words like extremely likely or incontrovertible, it's very rare to find scientific bodies using such strong language. And when they do use that sort of language, it's telling you something very important. It's telling you that we really are about as certain as scientists can be of anything, that climate change is real. It's due to us, and it will be a problem if we don't do something about it. It's already a problem, but we can still stem the tide.
So, Brenda, Michael mentioned cigarettes and how much it took years and years of obstruction on the part of the cigarette companies to admit that cigarettes caused lung cancer and other diseases, and there was also, safe cigarettes. Remember that? Well, now we have clean coal. But it does seem, though, that what's missing here is the second part of the argument, which is you can have a legitimate debate about what is being done to phase out cigarettes, and that is taxes, etc., whether they impact the poor more than the rich, etc. Those are legitimate arguments. So how come we haven't got to the really needed and legitimate arguments about what can be done about climate change? Because what I was trying to get to in my opening was, as far as I can tell, nothing is working. Nobody's come up with any kind of magic bullet, and there are all kinds of plans out there, but no action.
I think it's one of those situations where we don't realize the scale of action that's needed to really bend that atmospheric CO2 curve. This is not about recycling our plastic bags. And so that's why we wrote that book called Cooler, Smarter, because we wanted to, there was a lot of evidence out there that people were trying to do what people have a good sense. They want to try to solve this, especially when there's gridlock in Washington. And when you look at what's the most important thing, it's what we do in our daily lives. And that enters, wow, we're all part of this problem. It's just some activities are much worse than others. And as Michael said, some of those activities are tied to certain old ways of generating energy. And there's a lot of money and tied up interests to misrepresent the science. And if you keep the debate at the science, then you don't have to have the difficult discussions about what do we do. And I think ultimately at the bottom of this, we all do want to solve this problem, but it seems so overwhelming right now.
But for example, Michael, what do you do about China or India? I mean, I think China is producing one coal-fired plant per day or something amazing. At the same time, they are investing, I think, maybe 100 times more than we are in alternatives and dealing with climate change. Of course, you can't breathe the air in Beijing. So how do you even get to an international regime if you've got this buck passing going on?
Well, I think you sort of laid out the playing field pretty well here. You have countries like China who are now developing their energy economy, and if they can look at the U.S. and say, well, you guys have this legacy. You had 2 centuries of access, essentially free access to cheap, dirty energy. Shouldn't we get our turn? And who are we to tell them no if we don't have our own house in order, if we're not doing what they're already doing? For example, China at the regional level is now implementing a cap-and-trade scheme, and they're talking about having a national cap-and-trade scheme for limiting carbon emissions by 2016. We are nowhere close to that. It's difficult for us to imagine us having comprehensive climate and energy legislation anytime over the next 2 years, depending on what happens in this next election in part. China, in that sense, is doing more. They're ahead of us. They are ahead of us, as you alluded to, in how much they're investing in renewable energy. So yes, it's sort of the half empty, half full glass. You can look at China and see the China that is building a coal-fired power plant every 5 days, 5 days roughly.
5 days. I knew it was something extraordinary. Yeah.
But you can also see the China that is investing a whole lot more in renewable energy, that recognizes that climate change is already damaging them, damaging their economy, and is implementing market mechanisms to try to correct that. Obviously, any global treaty to limit carbon emissions comes up against the fact that we have different players with different legacies and different interests. And as Brenda already said, at least the U.S. can now go into this 2016, the next conference of the parties, the next major negotiation over climate change is the 2016 Paris meeting. And the U.S. can now go in saying, look, we, at the executive level, the president through the EPA has gone over the 2 main sectors of carbon emissions. The transportation sector, we've passed new fuel efficiency standards, and the power generation sector, these new coal-fired power plant standards. So at least the U.S. can go into those negotiations now saying, we've done what we can. There's some intransigence right now in the U.S. Congress, but we have action at the executive level. We have action at the state level, as California is a tremendous example of. And as we start to see states band together, the West Coast states, for example, forming a coalition to limit carbon emissions, the northeastern states, and we have action at the executive level, we can make some progress here in the U.S. and we can go into this 2016 Paris Treaty in good faith, having done something about this problem and ready to negotiate how we can all come to some sort of agreement to solve this problem.
Well, excuse me for being skeptical. I sure hope it works. Now, why can't we come up with a battery that maybe has like 10 times the range of current batteries? You're a scientist. I'm astounded that we're all begging Elon Musk to come up with the magic bullet, or some entrepreneur. Why hasn't it happened? What is the scientific barrier here to? Because that would make a massive difference, wouldn't it? If every car was a battery car, in spite of Naomi Klein sort of saying that the entrepreneurs are never going to make it, and trashing Elon Musk and saying it's useless to recycle. Something has to, incrementally, everybody has to get in on the act, don't they, and do something. And I can't understand why this is such a massive barrier, because to my mind, that's as close to the Gordian knot as there is.
Absolutely. When I was a scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, a little north of here in the state, and I would go over and talk to the energy battery guys, and they were saying, man, we have all these ideas and we have proposals, but our limited funding, we can't do all the great ideas that we have. So that's at the federal level. We haven't really had the Department of Energy really be the Department of Energy on the scale that would really jumpstart this, and private investment. If you've ever seen some of the battery, we could be further down the road on car transportation and batteries. There's some interesting movies documenting some of that. But I always like to say, there's an old saying, we didn't run out of stones. We didn't evolve out of the Stone Age because we ran out of stones. We were hunting whales to get whale oil. And then in Pennsylvania, that Drake oil well changed the fuel. And you should see the plots. I just was looking at it, of the whale oil for energy supply and turning on our lights. They plummeted and oil coming online. There is no reason, when you hear arguments that renewables can't do it, or other types of sources of energy that are not fossil fuel based, you look at those graphs. We've done it before. When we pivot and we really do it, we can go. And you look at the potential and the EIA potentials, and you look at other models, you see that, in fact, we are way underutilizing the smart power that we have, which is human ingenuity. In Germany, they invest in all their students because they're such a small country. They have to invest in their engineering. And there's still parts of the Apple that are built in Germany, and very expensive parts of very high labor costs. It can be done. It can be done.
So let's get to Q&A, because I know people wanted to have a discussion about this, albeit a civilized one. I believe this time around we're doing 5 cards. So can I have the cards? Oh, I see. Am I catching you unawares? So what's your sense then, Michael? What is the barrier? Is there a magic bullet here, a Gordian knot?
Well, I think it's interesting when you look at the solutions. Of course, clean energy, non-carbon energy, renewable energy, and right now, as Brenda was alluding to, we're not really investing enough even in the basic research and development in wind, in solar, in geothermal. You mentioned Naomi Klein, and I think there are a number of very interesting points that she makes in her recent book, but one place where I disagree with her is that she sort of dismisses the possibility that market mechanisms can solve this problem. And I actually think market mechanisms can solve this problem. We can solve this problem within the basic framework of capitalism, but we have to level the playing field. And right now, if you look at what we're doing, we are granting subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. So we're incentivizing the very form of energy that's damaging our climate. There's an externality. There are damages that are hidden when we emit carbon into the atmosphere, and we're not pricing them. And then you look at some of those very same interests, like, let's face it, the Koch brothers, who are funding the campaign to deny the reality and threat of climate change, and they are also funding groups like ALEC, who are interfering at state-level efforts to incentivize clean energy. You even have the state of North Carolina tell me that this is a free market ideological principle, trying to outlaw the sale of Teslas because of the influence of fossil fuel interests and groups like ALEC that are poisoning this discussion.
Well, here we have a question. If you stop emitting CO2, how fast do atmospheric levels decline?
If you stop emitting CO2. So if you stop emitting CO2, then the oceans will actually start to take up some of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere. So CO2 levels will slowly go down, but that process takes many decades. Most of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere right now will remain in the atmosphere on time scales of centuries. And that's why there really is what I have termed a procrastination penalty with this problem. Much of the CO2 that we've already put into the atmosphere is going to remain in the atmosphere for decades or centuries, and a lot of the warming, a lot of the CO2 we've put into the atmosphere is going to lead to warming for several more decades or even centuries because of the way that the warmth slowly penetrates into the ocean. And sea levels will gradually continue to rise because of the penetration of that heat into the ocean and the expansion of seawater with warming and the continued melting of the ice sheets. So this is a problem that has a very long legacy. And what that means is that if we are to avert catastrophic climate change, if we are to avert warming the planet by more than 2 degrees Celsius, 3.5 Fahrenheit, relative to pre-industrial time, we have to act now. We have to bring our emissions to a peak now. And I've been saying that for several years, okay? So now I really mean it.
Right.
We have to bring it to a peak now and down by several percent, probably 5 to 10% a year.
And we can't plant enough trees to soak it up, right?
No, there are other projects that we can engage in to try to take some of the CO2 out of the atmosphere, but it's not going to be,
Okay.
yeah.
So here's a question. Why does satellite data show global warming stopped or paused over 18 years ago, despite climate models predicting continued warming from increased CO2? Do you want to take that one on? I'm not sure about that one.
Some of that early satellite information was again, the scientific process kicked in, subsequent studies were published, and what they found was some of those early studies that there were some things were forgotten to take into account. When the satellite went over, the time of day it measured changes. So for example, if you're taking the 12 p.m. measurement, you're taking the 3 p.m. measurement, that's different times of the temperature. Also, there's a degrading satellite degradation of the orbit. You have to take into account that. And many other things. And when those calculations are corrected, you do not see the discrepancy. The atmosphere is warming as expected, the surface temperature is warming, and all the evidence lines up. Multiple lines of evidence all point to a warming planet.
Okay,
Quick follow-up.
I just want to get through.
Okay.
Look at the
All right.
stack here.
Okay.
Sorry. Some scientists believe a revival of nuclear is needed. Also, that the planet can't hope to feed 9 billion people without GMOs. Do you agree?
That is not my area of expertise. GMOs are not my area of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
Nuclear power is not my area of expertise. But as somebody who, like many of us, is interested in issues and cares about issues of sustainability broadly, I try to inform myself about these issues. My understanding is that right now, nuclear energy is probably not a viable strategy to meet our projected energy needs in a cost-effective way. I mean, there's a huge amount of infrastructure in building a nuclear power plant. You're making an investment on a 50 to 70-year time scale, and that might not make very much sense if we continue to see the sorts of advances that we're already seeing in wind and solar energy. And it comes with its own risk. We're talking about weighing different types of risk, risks with different spatial and temporal scales, as we have witnessed in the past few years. There are real risks that come with nuclear energy. There are obvious risks that come with fossil fuel energy. We need to find a way to weigh those risks, and that's frankly the sort of discussion that we need to be having. Let's get past this pretension that climate change isn't real, that it's not a problem, and let's have this worthy discussion about how to weigh the various types of risk inherent in different strategies for meeting our energy needs in a way that preserves the planet, preserves our environment, and meets growing global energy needs.
At what level, to your best estimate, plus or minus, will CO2 stabilize in parts per million?
It all depends on the choices we make. We decide in large part that there are natural processes that release carbon dioxide, volcanic eruptions, and other types of things, heat-trapping gases coming out of wetlands, for example, methane in the form of methane. And methane, by the way, turns into CO2. So it's a bridge fuel, but after about a decade, it turns into CO2, and then it lasts. 20% of it could still be trapping heat day in, day out for 800 years. It's important to remember that with natural gas. And so essentially, we are likely to double the CO2 within this century if we continue on the path we are currently on.
The European Commission proposes a 40% cut in CO2 emissions by 2030. One scientist from the IPCC, I think, said it was not enough to reach sufficient reduction by 2050. What do you think? What is your view on this, and what about the US?
Well, so globally right now, we need to bring our emissions to a peak, as I said, now, and I'm not kidding. I don't mean 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I mean now, and ramp them down by something approaching 10% per year, 5 to 10% a year, if we are to avoid breaching the 2 degrees Celsius limit, which, again, many scientists who study the impacts of climate change will tell you that's really where we start to see some very bad things happen. So there is an interesting discussion to be had about how we here in the U.S. achieve the cuts that we need to make, and the executive, as I said, branch is engaged in actions that put us on a course to reduce our emissions by something like 30% relative to 2005 levels over the next several decades, and that's what the globe as a whole has to do.
What do you say to a hefty carbon fee on emissions at their source? Sorry, I can't read that bit. Something about plus dividends given to households to offset the rising costs. Sorry about the...
Sure.
But I think you got the gist of it.
Absolutely. That is a very important idea, that right now one of the reasons perhaps that we haven't made as much progress is you're having many people around the world dividing the emissions in the atmosphere based on country level emissions. And it's very hard to get different emissions. See how many bills just in our country we have to get at this part, and the other part. Transportation, utilities, let's go after this and that. Lots of different, it takes time, delay, you name it. Why not go right to the source as part of it? Right now, that has not been a big part of the discussion. These are all mechanisms that economists and policymakers say could help reduce emissions, because if you have it at the source, then that ripples downstream. And of course, you have to have a mechanism to make sure that those most exposed and pay the highest share of their energy, of their income for energy, need to be inoculated from such a price change.
Electric car changing stations are on the rise. Is there significance to this? Great profit? Question.
Well, sure. The first Tesla I ever saw was in San Francisco about 5 years ago, and part of what is going to be necessary for companies like Tesla to remain successful and for other electric vehicle makers to be successful is to invest in the infrastructure. It's about having in place an infrastructure of charging stations so that people can not only do their commutes but can go on long trips as well on electric energy.
What chance do you give the UN in Paris to accomplish something meaningful? I know I'm going between the two of you.
Well, I do think there is one glimmer of hope that the one aspect of the international negotiations that is successful is we have measures in place to reduce tropical deforestation. And normally you list the top emitters by country, and the tropical deforestation, degradation is among the top few. And so it used to be 20% of the share, now it's 15% of the share. What happened was the degradation rate is about the same for the forests, but the rest of the country emissions have gone up, so the relative has gone down for forests. However, there is a lot of progress on that front, and that's very important. And I do think, based on my colleagues who are working that very that there's hope for Lima, but especially in Paris.
Shell Oil, Exxon, BP, the World Bank, and the IMF, and I think it says R Street, but I don't know, maybe that means K Street. And R Street?
R Street. It's a conservative think tank.
Oh, it is? Oh, and Brookings all favor a carbon tax. What say you? Is that true? I mean, I didn't know that Exxon...
ExxonMobil has in their, if you read their long-term planning documents, they recognize that there's going to be, a fee on emitting carbon somewhere in the range of $60 per ton over the next several decades. So, even ExxonMobil, while talking out of one side of their mouth, they're still funding quite a bit of the disinformation when it comes to climate change. But there's another side to the organization that has taken a sober look at this and recognizes that they're going to be dealing with this environment where there is going to be some pricing mechanism for carbon. And interestingly, and I alluded to this in my presentation, one of the things that actually gives me optimism is the fact that you do see a number of conservative institutions, conservative organizations. In fact, even Grover Norquist, for a period of 48 hours, was on record stating that he potentially could support a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Then I think he got a phone call from a couple brothers in Kansas, told him to change his tune. But the fact is, there are an increasing number of conservatives who are saying, let's have the worthy debate about how to solve this problem and make sure that conservative ideologies are present in that discussion. And, a revenue-neutral carbon tax would be one way of sort of pricing carbon in a way that would be faithful to principles, conservative principles, like not increasing the net taxation on the American people, for example.
Okay.
Could I just make one quick comment?
Well, no, look at the stack here. I'm just... No, seriously, because it's not fair, and I'm trying. The only ones I'm discarding are ones that we've already dealt with. Here we go. Can capitalism be defeated to stop the destruction of our natural world?
Brenda, I'm afraid that's yours.
Well, you got a red shirt on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, yes. Well, one thing we have to have is that what we do find is that, for example, when the market-based mechanisms to reduce acid rain, for example, did happen much faster because it was a market-based system than perhaps the regulators would have had the gumption to be able to pass. And so that historical lesson has taught us that often when there is an incentive and there is a declining cap, but you're not saying how the market will achieve it, then that could be a fair level playing field and let market forces achieve it. We would have had much slower reductions in that case if we hadn't had that combination of a regulation plus allowing market forces. So I'm not so sure that a pure dictator saying reduce it at this amount, we would have been worse off with the acid rain problem.
Okay, what are your present thoughts for the remaining years of the commercial life of the fossil fuel business in the US and the world? And what is your scenario for these developments?
Well, there's an interesting discussion that's taking place now about the notion of stranded assets. So, in an environment where we are likely to see some sort of price mechanism, some pricing of carbon, suddenly, these very large reserves, and by the way, we have 5 times enough fossil fuels in known reserves that are already, established by the fossil fuel industry, 5 times as much that's necessary to warm the planet beyond 2 degrees Celsius. So if we were to mine even, 1/5 of the fossil fuels that we already know are accessible, that would be enough to warm the planet into what we might already describe as dangerous and irreversible climate changes. So the fact is that we need a pricing mechanism that makes sure that doesn't happen. And that can be done through market mechanisms, but that means that the cap has to be set properly, or if it's a carbon tax, the tax has to be set properly, has to be set in such a way that we level the playing field, that we make sure that that externality, the damage that we're doing to the planet, is taken into account when in the energy marketplace, when we allow fossil fuel interests to compete with other energy.
What do you think of growing algae and burying it on a vast scale to sequester carbon from the atmosphere and using some to make carbon neutral biodiesel fuel?
Well, certainly algae is very efficient at doing photosynthesis and sucking carbon dioxide. I mean, nature has really been much more magical about it than we have been able to design. So why not use some of those mechanisms? And certainly burying it in one of the deepest trenches in the world, Marianas Trench, that might help. But that idea, that general idea of sequestering the carbon, that we've put out of balance, we've dug up old carbon, released in the atmosphere. If we can have a renewable cycle of carbon and get sequestering some of the carbon, that is a way. Certainly fossil fuel industry has some of the techniques with enhanced oil recovery. Instead of recovering the oil, perhaps sequester the carbon, as well as algae and trying to sequester. Right now it's algae, and then if you burn it, you're getting it back into the atmosphere. It's a living thing, but
Right.
I like the idea of sequestering it.
Since the effects are coming more rapidly than predicted, doesn't that mean that the 2 degrees Celsius can no longer be considered the threshold of safety to avoid irreversible climate change, leading to a 10 to 14 degrees Celsius warming by 2300? Well, I'm certainly not going to be around for that one, but what do you think?
Yeah, it's true that with respect to some of the metrics of climate change, we are ahead of schedule. We are seeing Arctic sea ice disappear at a faster rate than what the models predicted just a few years ago. We are seeing the ice sheets already begin to lose ice decades before the models actually said that we would see that. So in many respects, and the irony, of course, you hear the claim made that, well, climate scientists were alarmists, we're trying to scare the public. It's what we were talking about before. If anything, our instincts as a community have been overly conservative. And it's those conservative instincts, in part, that have led us to underpredict the rate and magnitude of some of the changes that we are now seeing. This idea of 2 degrees Celsius as sort of the dangerous limit, 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit, it's an imperfect metric itself. If we look globally at the aggregate impacts of climate change on food and water and human health and everything else, what we see is in that graph that I showed briefly, you sort of enter into the red zone. With respect to all those impacts, things start to look really bad at about 2 degrees Celsius. But if you talk to people who lost their homes to Hurricane Sandy, if you talk to people who are facing inundation in low-lying island nations or even southern Florida, if you speak to an audience of Californians who are probably close to facing things like water rationing if things don't turn around in the near future. By many measures, we are already seeing dangerous climate change. And so the 2 degrees Celsius mark, that's somewhat subjective. We've already increased CO2 more than we should have. We've already created more climate change than we should have. We are already seeing damaging impacts of climate change. The question is simply how much farther down this road are we willing to go? And the prudent thing would be to take the next possible exit ramp.
Putting a value on carbon through taxation is a great idea with virtually no prospect of being implemented. Do you see any prospect for using CO2 from the atmosphere as a feedstock to replace oil refining with a CO2 refining coupled to a renewable power generation like they are doing in Iceland? Do you know about that?
So what we see is that there are different techniques. If you want to capture CO2 right at the source of, say, a burning coal-fired power plant or natural gas plant, turning it into CO2 by burning it, you're right at the source. There's much more right there. When you're trying to distill it from the atmosphere, it is at 350, we're up at 400 parts per million for part of the year, 398 for annual average, 399. And that is a very small concentration, but as I say, arsenic can be very small, and it's extremely natural, and it's harmful. So that tiny concentration from a diffuse gas in the atmosphere is very hard to capture. So either we have to do it, we have to just not emit it. That's far better than trying to design ways to capture it. It's very expensive to capture it. Burying it, we can do. The fossil fuel industry knows how to do that.
I'm having trouble reading this, but estimates of the GHG impacts from biofuels run the full gamut from decidedly beneficial to woefully counterproductive. Do you think California's historic low-carbon fuel standard is overly reliant on the use of ethanol as a so-called low-carbon fuel, and should CARB phase out the use of this dubious low-carbon fuel?
Okay, well, I'm not an expert on the details of the current scheme in California. What I can tell you is that there are certain pathways, biofuels pathways, which may not be as carbon efficient as they seem because it takes a certain amount of energy to refine and transport fuels. In the process, if you are looking at inefficient pathways of extracting ethanol, they may not actually be carbon efficient relative to other renewable energy or other ways of reducing our carbon emissions. That's why there is research into alternative pathways, cellulosic ethanol, which are more efficient. But corn-based ethanol is not necessarily a viable solution. On the surface, it sounds good because after all, biofuel, it took the carbon out of the atmosphere. It's a zero-sum game, right? You're just putting the CO2 back into the atmosphere. But if you're using energy to refine and through the series of processes that's used to extract that ethanol, and that energy has to come from somewhere, well, you may lose whatever gains might have been apparent. So it is critical to understand the full pathway and the energy that's used along that pathway in weighing these different alternatives.
As you know, California is, I think, partially a receipt of $1 billion over this fiscal year for the state's cap and trade system. In your opinion, how should this new revenue be invested to produce the largest reduction in greenhouse gas emissions?
Certainly other solutions to reducing emissions directly. The distributed any other way, it's not going to reduce the emissions. And so there are many menu of options that California can do. If you end up not reinvesting it, what we have is the example. California is one state. We have the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast. The states that reinvested in the renewable energy and other ways of reducing emissions, they saw their economies grow faster and more jobs, because that industry is a big growth, especially for job creation, than the states within the New England states that are a part of RGGI, that they just did not reinvest. They put it back into the general coffers of the state, and the state did not do as well. It's a very interesting study. We can send Ian the information.
Politicians are using the drought in California to get money, Prop 1, to perpetuate false solutions, dams. How vulnerable are the masses to greenwashing and false solutions?
Well, that's always a danger, isn't it? I mean, the real solution is multifaceted. I mean, there are gains in water efficiency that are possible. There's an interesting, debate taking place, I know, in California right now in the partitioning of water for, hydraulic fracturing, right? We're using, at a time when we have precious little, fresh water resources, some of that increasingly large amount of that is being used for fracking, and that's got to be part of the discussion as well. And of course, climate change is complicating all of this. There was actually a study that came out a decade ago that a peer-reviewed article that said that the decreasing Arctic sea ice was going to lead to a change in the pattern of the northern hemisphere jet stream that would give California decreased winter precipitation. This was predicted a decade ago, and there are now a slew of studies that are demonstrating that there likely is a connection between climate change, decreasing Arctic sea ice, and the pattern that the jet stream is taking, which is depriving California of some of that precipitation it would normally get. And then you've got warmer soils, especially in the summer, evaporating more water into the atmosphere. So this is something that's not likely to get better. It's likely to get worse, decreased runoff from decreased snowpack, and all of that is on a collision course with growing population and growing competition for the water resources that are available. I don't know the solution, I know the problem, but obviously any reasonable solution is going to involve some pretty serious adaptive strategies to deal with what is likely to be diminishing freshwater availability in this state.
So here's something I'm completely unaware of. A no-carbon liquid fuel, NH3, is made of air and water. NH3 powered Army turbine aircraft in the 1960s. We sold 6 billion gallons last year. Pipelines run through states. NH3, thousands of Americans work with NH3. What's NH3?
Wow. So I'm not aware of that history.
Wow.
It's ammonia.
I know.
Okay.
But the jet fuel, I mean.
Yeah, well, okay.
I'm not sure.
As a solution to reduce carbon emissions, what do you think of a carbon fee and dividend program? Revenue neutral with all revenue distributed equitably to households, as proposed by Citizens Climate Lobby.
Well, I think it's an excellent proposal, but I'm going to, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I feel that my role as a climate scientist, speaking out on the threat of climate change, is to inform the discussion of solutions, not to prescribe the solutions. So I would be ecstatic if our U.S. Congress right now, if the U.S. House of Representatives was debating different price mechanisms for solving the problem, rather than denying that climate change even exists, which is what the Science Committee of the U.S. House of Representatives currently does. They don't even accept that climate change is real. What we need to have is, again, a worthy discussion of the solutions, and I'm not going to weigh in on any one of them because my view is that we ought to be able to trust the political process to make those decisions as long as it's operating under a fair set of ground rules. And right now it isn't. As long as we continue to deny that the threat even exists, we can't have the worthy debate that we need to have about how to solve the problem. So revenue neutral carbon tax, I think, is a viable mechanism, as is cap and trade. There are a variety of schemes. And how much we incentivize renewable energy, these are all reasonable things for us to be debating. I'm not going to weigh in on any one of them other than to say that that's the discussion we ought to be having right now in the U.S. Congress, not is climate change a hoax.
This may have to be our last question here. The TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, a new trade agreement, does not appear to have greenhouse gas limits, appearing to export pollution-causing industries to third world countries. How do we protect countries like Malaysia from this?
That is a challenge, and that's one of the problems with the emissions by country. Do we charge China for all the products that they're making that ends up in many of our box stores or that we're buying? So that's one of the accounting of where these emissions are coming from and who we charge is something that is really worthy of a debate. And that's why I think more and more people are looking at the upstream. Let's start it at the source and then let the ripple effects happen. And so Malaysia is something that is incredibly important for many Indonesian. I mean, I know we're running out of time, so I don't want to get into that whole story, but it's a very good question.
Indonesia is burning all of its rainforests
Absolutely.
for palm oil.
It's
People should not touch palm oil. It's
And
destroying the planet.
they're the industries who are now, in the last year, major gains in trying to get more sustainable palm oil. And so it used to be that all palm oil was very unsustainable. And so within the last 6 months to a year, it's been dramatic, and that's because of consumer pressure. It's been very impressive.
So just in closing, do you think that we, since the politicians clearly are failing us, can the people form a kind of global patriotism and sort of rally together under the same flag since the entire planet is threatened?
I think that that's really important because the atmosphere is not partisan. And it doesn't care where the CO2 comes from, or the methane, or the nitrous oxide. And so we all are part of the solution. And that's why I have hope. Because if it really was completely natural and if we were not so intricately part of the problem, then I'd have no hope. The reason I'm up here is because we can turn the tide. We do have many options.
Last word on that question.
Amen.
Okay. Very fuel efficient. All right. Brenda will be up in the lobby along with Michael, who'll be signing his book, so you can continue the conversation with them in the lobby, and they'll be up there in a minute.